How would you recommend people kind of uncover some of those ableist assumptions?
I mean, one of them is just to actually talk to people who've lived these experiences. So remembering that one person with disability is one person with disability, one person who's disabled is one person who's disabled. In the autistic community, there's this notion that if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. So, like, no one can be the gatekeeper for an entire embodiment or diagnosis because these things don't function that way, right? But finding some people, if you are non-disabled, finding some disabled colleagues or friends to chat with. That would be some stuff, but also knowing that their job is not to teach you. So you have to, like, you should never go into a relationship with that intent. But like having conversations, it's useful to look at research, look at who's talking about these things. I think about one of the ways I connected earlier on in my career with people who were thinking about similar-ish stuff was, number one, Joe Abramo published an article that said the social model of disability in Music Educators Journal. That told me that I could talk to Joe because I wasn't knowing that that word was something. Or like I read something and I realized that like Adam Patrick Bell was someone that I could contact and actually talk to. And they would be able to point me in the right direction for resources. In some respects, that's the connection here, is finding resources.
Yeah.
If we're talking about specifically controllers or things that there is an identifiable creator, like you can't talk to Sachs, right? Like you can't email him. He's been dead for a while. All right. But like you can email the team at Apple that does GarageBand and ask them about their accessibility. You could ask them about how do screen readers work. I mean, you're going to develop your language and the things you're going to become more conscious about through engaging. I mean, you can buy or engage with really simple disability studies introductions. Like I've got one next to me because I'm using it in a project called Disability Studies, A Student's Guide by Colin Cameron. It's a really short kind of thing. Those things would give you ideas for where to go next. We live in a time when YouTube exists, and there are plenty of, if you type in disabled and something and critique, you could probably find it. So that's helpful to me. In the same kind of respect, even if it's not about your field, finding any time that disabled folk or folk with disabilities are talking about their lives, using that. So Alice Wong has a book called Disability Visibility, and it's stories of disabled folk. Read things like that. They're stories, which is really, really fun in some respects, right? Because you can actually get a sense of these things through lived experience rather than through like dissected analysis. Use social media if that's the kind of person you are. And like Twitter, hashtag actually autistic is a really helpful feed to me because it's often people talking about stuff that I would never have thought of because I don't live in that same kind of body or mind. Like I remember when cognitive behavioral therapy first was starting to become critiqued in more public spaces. Well, the actually autistic community have a lot to say about that. Finding that stuff out, I mean, you can just as simple as you're starting to grow your consciousness about things that are related to disability, take a word and search it in one of the social media feeds. Just see how that word comes up. See if there's been debate about it. Looking into professional and scholarly work is also really helpful. Like whatever field you're in, I'm sure there's some kind of publication and it either has spoken about these things or not. And if it hasn't, then you should be one of those people who requests a commentary on it. If you are in computer science and you don't think that they've talked enough about disability studies-based notions of education, you need to be the one who asks for it. It's unexhaustible, the options you have, right? But I would also say, like, don't just limit yourself to things about disability, because things about race and disability are hyper-connected. Things about ethnicity and race and disability are hyper-connected, especially in education. So like if you look in the history of special education, a lot of it came about to deal with people whose body minds did not fit the English-speaking white expectations of schools, right? And that's not a critique on special educators that are out there. I don't want that to be seen as that, but we look at the history of things. Finding that out makes you go, okay, so if I study a little bit more about anti-racism, I bet I'm going to probably also get a broader understanding of anti-oppressive education.
Right.
Which, I mean, at least in my experience, that's how it's been. Like when I look at this, I think about race and then I think about other intersections of oppression. And it makes me go, okay, what would the analog be for disability in this situation? Okay, well, what that would look like if I plugged it into computer science. I think the last little thing is just have conversations with your colleagues about this stuff.
Yep.
And don't let it get pushed off. it's not okay to have a conversation about disability that is just that kid has ADHD and they're really hyper and that's all we're going to talk about disability. No, like talk about accessibility and equity for disabled folk and folk with disability. Like talk about how can this thing be perceived and manipulated visually? How can it be done orally? How can it be done kinesthetically? How can it be done just about any other ways that we perceive and can articulate information? And it's not good enough to just do one. You need to have multiple. And so talking to your colleagues about ways to create multiple lines of access does a lot for everyone. It does a lot for broad notion of diversity of thinking and embodiment. It does a lot about helping you think through multiplicity of teaching strategies, and it starts good conversations.
This excerpt of the CSK8 podcast is from episode number 95, which is titled Exploring Disability and Connecting with the Arts with Jesse Rathgeber.